Please join me in welcoming Dr. Meixner.
Thanks, Ben. Well, thank you all for coming today. This is the 32nd El Dia del Agua. This event started in 1991, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. As you probably are aware, right, today is a professional quality student research symposium, so much so that I think oftentimes some of the best 5 to 15-minute talks I see are here in both the hydrologic and atmospheric side. This year, it's, as near as I can tell, the largest El Dia that we've ever had. Nearly 60 student presentations, over 150 registered participants. And this year's theme is Our Water, Our Air, and it falls on World Water Day, March 22nd, which notably, the very first El Dia back in 1991 also occurred on World Water Day, March 22nd. Right, this year, I think you'll see the talks, the students have done a good job putting them into themes in sort of the 3 different oral sessions and across the 2 poster sessions. And we're going to be exploring the links between hydrology and atmospheric science, as well as connections out to special social challenges, and with, given where we are, a specific focus on the arid Southwest. In particular, I'd like to start off this morning by thanking all the conference organizers. They've been working really hard. I'm actually surprised Quinn is physically standing and capable to talk. I credit the coffee, but Quinn, along with Alsali, Abigail, Reza, Hannah, Stella, and Sidian have all worked really hard to create this day, and they've done a really good job at breaking apart the pieces of preparation for this event, which it's an organizational challenge and in many ways a professional development opportunity for all involved. I'd also like to thank Irma, Terry, and Tim, Irma Santander, Terry Thompson, and Tim Corley for all their hard work coming into today. Irma's supposed to be able to work remote 3 days a week. That has not been the case for the last week and a half. So there's also a number of faculty, both the academic advisors and committee members who probably helped the students with their presentations, but also Ty Foray, Martha Whitaker, and Brittany Cincerelli, who have helped compose and create the day and the presentations. I'm not going to go into all their names, but I will remind you that you do have a program. And on page 10 and 11, you have all the sponsors for this day for whom this day would not occur. Some of them are supporting awards. Some of them are supporting their funds are going to support the various refreshments and eating sort of accoutrement that we have today. You know, I didn't get a chance to look at all the presentations because I heart and head and I have too many things on my plate. But I was impressed with about 12 of the presentations I was able to look through yesterday. I'm looking forward to hearing everything today. I think, as always, really great and cutting-edge science going on in the department, and connection to the community and the wider world through our work. You know, as I mentioned earlier, today is the 32nd El Dia del Agua y la Atmosfera. Although it started out as the hydrology research expedition, it was eventually renamed El Dia del Agua, and then when our departments merged 7 years ago, it became El Dia del Agua y la Atmosfera. As one of my friends noted in grad school, El Dia del Agua sounds like a 1950s Mexican horror movie. Adding the la Atmosfera actually, you know, and the atmosphere, I think, pulls off some of that horror film milieu. But really, the gentleman who was sort of instrumental in creating the first hydrology research symposium was a gentleman named Dennis Shield. And I'd just like to say a few words about Dennis. Dennis was sort of handed the task at the time in 1991 by our department head of the Hydrology and Water Resources Department at the time, Sru Sarushian. Just a simple task, just organize a little research symposium. As anyone who's participated, simple and easy are not what go with creating this day of research and discussion. The first one was a success, and as we all stand here, we know that it's continued to be successful. The event was Dennis's baby, but I think also shortly after I returned here in 2005, Dennis once described Aldea as the day where our family gets together. This is the day that the hydrology and atmospheric sciences family gets together to discuss our science, to discuss our community, to discuss what we've done and where we're headed. And that vision of his, I think, is very much alive and well. Dennis, in many ways, was for many years the glue that held sort of anyone who participated in the field courses in the department or any active field exercises at the West Campus Ag Center. Dennis was the person who made things happen. Things got done. We didn't always know how, but he always got everything done. And we owe to him the fact that our field course, for example, is able to go to Lake Patagonia State Park and Dead Horse Ranch State Park because Dennis created and developed those relationships and facilitated our ability to go do those, I think, really integrative synthetic field exercises that really enrich our students' education and training. Dennis, of course, did a lot of other things in the department. I always thought of him as both the drill sergeant and the quartermaster for the department. Again, got things done. Dennis isn't able to be here today, but we want to thank him for all his years of service and celebrate his legacy and his contributions by having a great research symposium today. With that, I will turn it back to Quinn, who will move us along in the program.
Right, I will move quickly here. Thanks, Tom. Thank you for that. I want to turn our attention to kind of the rest of the event, the theme for the event. Can we put the land acknowledgement back up there? Okay, so the theme of Aldea this year is our water, our air. But the question I want to ask is whose water, whose air? This is going to be a little bit preachy, but bear with me. My mom and I are very close, and I like to talk with her about my research. She asked me last month, though, why are you doing this and who does it affect? And guys, when you study Bayesian inference, that's not something you think about a whole lot. I didn't have a good answer for her. The purpose of this theme is to help us to think about Mom's question. Whose air, whose water? It's to help link our science to the land and the people amongst whom we live and breathe. After all, we are here in Arizona, in the arid Southwest, and all the other places we've lived and operated across the world. So the student presenters here are thinking about our water, our air. They come from across, you guys come from across the University of Arizona, not just the Department of Hydrology and Atmospheric Sciences. You come from institutions as far as Sonora. You even come from community schools. Dr. Manoli's St. Cyril's Academy, middle schoolers, they're here today to share with you their work. And they study themes from across the hydrology and atmospheric sciences continuum. Even one abstract, is Winchen in here? One abstract reads, can hydrologists study fuel cells? That's the abstract title. And apparently, yes, we can. So today there will be 3 oral sessions, 2 student poster sessions. If you want to know more about when those are, please just scan the QR code. I hope that works. And at the end of the day, we're going to give out almost $10,000 in prizes, which is pretty remarkable. It's a lot of money. And now I'm going to turn our attention to the speakers. We have a set of speakers today who are also asking the question, whose air, whose water? Whose air, whose water is first asked by our keynote panel on water security in the arid Southwest. The outstanding folks on this panel who join us from advocacy, industry, regulatory backgrounds, they're not necessarily the ones that I see in the corridors of our building, in the corridors of Harshbarger. So I'd like to think this will be an eye-opening and interesting discussion that challenges some of the underlying assumptions about the way in which we do our science. And I hope you will join me in listening with an open mind and an attentive ear. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Meca Pereira, and she's a graduate student here in the department. She's going to facilitate this discussion and call up our three panelists. Please join me in welcoming Meca to the stage. Thank you, guys.
Hi, can you hear me? All right, thanks. I'll try to follow up Quinn's enthusiasm. I'm Meca, I'm a grad student here in the department, and bear with me as I sort of read the introduction for this panel. So this panel is titled Water Security in the Arid Southwest, Structures, Science, and Solutions. For Arizona and the Southwest, securing water for people and nature is a non-trivial challenge with ties to the interaction of climate, infrastructure, and history. So that challenge has been recently amplified by Tier 1 shortage on the Colorado River and COVID-19 issues dealing with water insecurity. But water security means different things to science advocacy and industry leaders who use the terms, and not all of us have a clear idea of what the term water security means. As panelist Janene Yazzie of Sixth World Solutions states, our challenges are so complex, our histories are so complex, and our solutions need to mirror that, informed by the limitations and types of relationships that exist within our ecosystem. So what does securing water mean? How do we go about it? And where do scientists fit in? So we have three panelists here to speak to those ideas, and I'll invite you guys to come up. The first is Janene Yazzie, co-founder of Sixth World Solutions and Southwest Regional Director with NDN Collective. Next is Sandy Fabritz-Whitney, Director for Water Strategy at Freeport-McMoRan and former Director of DWR, and Terry Sue Rossi, Water Resource Manager at Arizona Water Company. Thank you so much for being here in person, and thank you guys for being here in person. We also have attendees over Zoom, so that's exciting. So I'll be asking some questions that a group of students organizing this conference has prepared, and at the end we'll have time for questions from the audience. So to start, I'll invite you all to talk about your backgrounds and how that sort of shapes your definition of water security. So we can start with Janene and go down the row. Thank you. Oh, sorry. I mean, I'm loud, but not that loud. Is this better? Oh, okay, there we go. I am born for the Blackstreet Wood people and the Bitterwater clans of the Navajo Nation. And really my background started with my birth, being Indigenous and being from the Rio Perco Valley communities. I was born into communities that were heavily impacted by the legacy of uranium mining and processing and church rock, culminating with the 1979 church rock uranium mill tilling spill, the largest spill of radioactive material here in the contiguous United States. And so I grew up already being exposed to the impacts of that. Just recently, the Navajo birth cohort study has proven that women who are pregnant and exposed to uranium contamination can pass that exposure through the uterus to their child. And when that child's a female child and develops all the eggs that they will ever carry in their lifetime while in the womb, what we're witnessing is real-time impacts on multiple generations for decades.
And so not only are there those physical health impacts, but there's been the socio-cultural impacts to my communities who were no longer able to gather medicines or produce foods and maintain the food systems that sustained our people for millennia because the water was no longer trusted. The water was hurting us. And so when I think about water security and the journey that I'd had to take, being a reservation girl, just a little res girl, growing up in communities fighting so many front lines and wanting to seek a path that would allow me to return to my homelands and be part of the solutions. That journey took me everywhere. I learned that as Indigenous peoples, not only can we not choose our battles, but we have to become experts at everything to understand our own oppression and to understand why our communities are in the situation that they're in. And so originally wanting to be a doctor, I ended up landing and building expertise in the field of human rights and international politics because I refused to allow the federal regulations that have kept our people from being able to restore our responsibility to our water and our natural resources from happening. And those are the threats that we continue to have now. And so when I think about water security, I don't think about water rights. I think about the broken relationship that has created so much devastation in our communities, that has disconnected all our peoples, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, from the sacredness of our water being and from the understanding that we carry every day a responsibility to treat this water being with utmost reverence and with care so that it can sustain itself. And so water security isn't about, maintaining our water systems for human consumption. It's about maintaining our water systems so that life can continue. And that's the framework that we operate by and the work that we do with communities.
I can use this. Can you hear me in the back there? Thank you. And thank you, Janene, for that. I think that's very helpful and very insightful on what the Indigenous communities are facing, have been facing, and are facing today. I, on the other hand, grew up as a little farm girl, farming and ranching in the Southwest here in Arizona and in Colorado. Our family was sort of nomadic in that we farmed here we farmed in the Phoenix area, but at the time it wasn't anything like it was today. It was very rural in nature. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, but now it's in the middle of the city of Peoria. So it's right in the heart of Maricopa County. Then also we would go back and forth and ranch in Western Colorado, and water and air and land. I would hear all the time growing up how wasteful and how farmers and resource managers had no care for their land. And I would go home and talk to my father and accuse him of, the horrible things that he was doing to the land and the water. And he would just pat me on the head and say, you'll learn one day that the land is everything to us. The water is everything to us. Why would I waste it? And that lesson, as I grew older and really became more aware of what was going on around me and watching our family struggle in its own ways, and sometimes with and without water as droughts came and went, and having to go collect, carcasses of cattle that were dying, not by any mismanagement, but by Mother Nature's, this is what Mother Nature does from time to time. It is a harsh environment that we are living in. We still live in a harsh environment even with all the wonderful technology that we have. There are communities and people still living in these harsh environments. And that was a wonderful lesson for me and really helped open my eyes as I started exploring what I wanted to do. I knew I did not want to be a lawyer. I did not want to, I didn't want to be a doctor because, I've done a lot of mandatory veterinary work for my father and was not real happy about, cutting into people after that. But I wanted to fix problems, and I wanted to be a person who found solutions to problems. And my background, I went to Arizona State, and go Devils. Well, I'm not holding it against you. This is my one time a year I'm here in Tucson, and I did it for you. No. No, but I went to the Arizona State University, and I found this wonderful little hidden college in the engineering program in the sector. I had already gotten 1 degree in civil engineering, and found this wonderful college, and it was called the Natural Resources. It was Natural Resources in Agriculture was the program, oddly enough. And the classes were ecology, hydrology, silviculture, riparian management, livestock management, crop management, range management. I mean, every ology and natural resource management program combined into one. And that really opened my eyes about how everything is so connected, and how we are all so connected to the land and the air and the water. And that was probably the most amazing experience that I've ever gone through. And that really helped me sort of bring my version, or what I believe long-term sustainability is. It's not just water, it's everything. And that's where it all comes together. So one little thing done over here is going to have an impact, or 10 over here, here, and here. So that's really what my background is, and what really sort of framed my perspective, and how I actually still work today in my field, even though I'm in water. So.
My name is Terry Surasi. Can everybody hear me okay? And I'm the Water Resources Manager for Arizona Water Company. And so I hadn't really thought about from the perspective of talking more personally, but since my colleagues have brought up some personal things, I was raised in Colorado. My father was also raised in Colorado. I was raised in the same home that my father was raised in. And part of our family legacy was a little piece of property at the headwaters of the Colorado River, and that's at a little lake called Grand Lake, which is a natural lake. And we would always go and visit that property and play in that area, and then by that my whole life. And then when my as a child, and then when my grandmother died, we took her ashes and we actually buried it on the property. And I never imagined that as a little child, jumping across stones, where the Colorado River is quite narrow, that one day I would grow up and work in water resources. I would, in fact, come to this campus and walk on this campus and get my bachelor's degree from this university, unlike my colleague to the right, unlike Sandy, and go on to get a master's degree from Rutgers University in water policy before I would come to work in Arizona and in water resources. And I've worked in a number of different organizations. Sandy and I both worked for the Department of Water Resources at the same time early on in our careers. We were just a few years younger than we are now, I think. And then I eventually became the first water resources manager for the cities of Peoria, for the city of Surprise, and became the first water resource manager for the 2 largest private water companies in the state, a company called EPCOR, and I now work for a company called Arizona Water Company. And I also work for, oh my word, I'm feeling the mic is a little hot.
Sorry about that.
And so I was also the first water policy analyst for the Central Arizona Project, and Sandy and I both served as technical administrators in the Arizona Water Banking Authority. So we've had a lot of very similar experiences and a lot of very different experiences. And I think that that when I think about water resources in Arizona, one of the things that when I was told what the theme was is I've really struggled with what is water security. And so I read some things in the past week and have tried to kind of get my head around it from my perspective, but also from the perspective of some others that I've read. So I I read a bunch of stuff and I came up with a definition that I was going to kind of use as kind of an operating definition for, at least for myself. And obviously I'm going to learn a lot today from everybody else, but kind of where I'm starting from is that water security is it's the capacity of a population to manage its water resources to provide an adequate quantity of water at acceptable levels of quality to sustain safe, healthy livelihoods, including political stability and peace in our lives. And I had never actually really thought about it from that perspective. And so as I've studied the different questions that we're going to be asked today, I've tried to think about it within that context, that we know when we think about water resources, it isn't, we haven't really thought about it within the context that I just heard Janene describe, which is how it's really woven into the fabric of our lives, and it's about relationships. And I think that that really is true when you start to look at it at this different level. And we all need to find what is our role in that conversation? How do we show up? What are we responsible for? What do we need to take care of our own? What do we need to take care of for other people? And it's a really big topic. So I'm very excited about the conversation today. Very appreciative of being invited to be on this panel, and very happy to be back at my alma mater.
Thank you. Yeah, when we had a pre-meeting, Terry Sue made a good point about how maybe as scientists, we often think about water security meaning water sustainability in terms of physical supply and demand. And that might be one metric, but there are a broader and maybe more intimate suite of things to think about with water security. So I guess to follow up directly on that, the next question, well, sort of two follow-up questions, since we're speaking to physical scientists, we need metrics, right, to look at water security. So ideally, what metrics would you use to sort of evaluate water security? So these could be physical, economic, political, cultural. And second, in your line of work, what's sort of the biggest impediment that you're facing, either short-term or long-term? So again, we can start with Janene. Yeah.
We're going to switch up who starts. As an Indigenous person working on rights issues, oftentimes we're confronted with demands for more information, for data, for proof, to show why something's important, why certain action matters, and why we are so confident in the potential results of taking those actions. Being in an Ivy League institution, I've learned very well why that's important to the Western mind. But when it comes to my communities and trying to talk about these things, when you ask them about metrics that they need to tell them that the water is sustainable or healthy, or that we are doing a good job preserving it and taking care of it for future generations, it's a really alien question, because how do you measure the feeling of safety? How do you measure the feeling of trust in your water? Because those are the two fundamental things that have been disrupted and taken from us through colonization and through the use of our lands, territories, and resources as resource colonies, so that cities and towns like Tucson and Phoenix could exist. The electricity and the coal to provide that electricity was sourced off of Dine lands. And our largest, purest aquifer was completely violated in ways that were unsustainable in order to move that coal and provide that electricity. What metrics were those projects developed on? Because those metrics did not include the impact to the well-being and to the safety, or to the rights, the basic rights of my own people who still live without electricity in that very area, while huge power lines go over our lands, and who still do not have access to clean water. And yet they are often the most invisibilized when it comes to the state's discussions around what water security looks like for the state and the need to settle the claims of these tribal nations that weren't counted as humans until recently in all water negotiations and in the seven state compact of the Colorado River. And so I was thinking about this question, like, what are those metrics? Because these guys want to know. These guys want to know. And maybe if there's a way to answer this question, there's a way to build alliances and partnerships and collaborations that can restore those inequalities and injustices that we're facing, so that we can have a new playing field, a new foundation for imagining what our collective responsibilities are going forward. And still, I could not really come up with what those answers are, other than that when in the work that I'm doing to create Dine-centered approaches to research and evaluation of many of the different issues that we're facing, the elders that I work with always come back to the importance of understanding what question you are asking and why, and who the beneficiaries of that are going to be. And so Quinn, I resonate a lot with your mom. And in doing that work, and coming from a Dine worldview, and why that's important, is because our core values as Indigenous peoples speak of that relationship that must be upheld. We already are born knowing from the first words, ya'ate, which doesn't mean hello, but is a greeting and an understanding that I am the center of my universe and you are the center of yours. And both those things are true. Both those things are valid, and both those things are sacred. And so from the very beginning of our first words, we are instilled with the knowledge that we are interconnected. We are instilled with the belief that our purpose on this life as five-fingered holy beings, as earth surface dwelling people, is to live in harmony with those sacred things around us, to find our pathway so that we can respect and restore those relationships. And that's a beautiful thing. And it's important for us to start from that place, because that's the only way we can step outside the institutional conditioning that has happened to everyone, that creates this lens that these resources are here for exploitation, extraction, and for development, for human-centric purposes. And that's not the case. So I brought this question to my elders as well, and they kind of laugh, because we're like, oh, metrics again. What are those quantifiable variables that we can use to evaluate our progress? And the thing that we started to speak about is just how for us, our own metrics are the well-being of our people, the well-being of our children. And what's necessary to facilitate and uphold that. And right now, if we were to use, just even try to articulate that into one solid metric, like how do we capture protecting the well-being of our children, and use that to gauge our water security and evaluate our water security on the Navajo Nation, I can tell you that there's even less people than those who have access to plumbing, than those who have access to water, that would be able to prove have that type of security. Because even the waters that are coming into our homes are poorly managed. The science that we've created about what are acceptable levels of exposure to different metals do not include the cumulative exposure that we have every day living in the midst of sacrifice zones, surrounded by different types of contamination in our air, in our soil, in our vegetation, and in our water. And so even those standards aren't good enough if we're to create a metric for what we want to ensure the well-being of our children. And that's just thinking of it from a human perspective, because our culture tells us that that's not it, that we must also think of the most vulnerable in our earth systems and in the cycles of non-human life. And the quality of our soil, the impact to our insects, the impact to our water bugs is just as important to us when we're talking about the type of metrics that we need to be concerned about when we're pursuing restoring our waters and protecting the quality and quantity of our water systems. And to me, that makes, that feels most right. That's what resonates with my sense of purpose as a 5-fingered earth surface holy being, of like what we should be doing in order to walk a path in this world that helps create and respect the type of relationships that will protect us, but that will also preserve the beauty of the world that we have for future generations.
All right, go ahead, Sandy.
So yeah, as a practitioner of water resources and really coming from a very data-oriented scientific background in this field, obviously metrics are extremely important for many aspects, and the value of those metrics, obviously the trust of those metrics, and those things are an integral part of that. But it's the transparency of that information that we're collecting, the transparency of how we're putting that data together. I mean, I was working at the Department of Water Resources early on. Actually, Terry Sue was the one who hired me into my first permanent job. I started as an intern there. Then my first job, I actually worked for Terry Sue, and my life was all about spreadsheets. And you can really get into the numbers, and you're collecting water use data, you're collecting field acres, you're collecting golf course acres, but that doesn't tell you like exactly what Janene's saying, the value of that resource, and bringing that all together. How do you bring that all together? That's really the challenge for all of us. And the public demands metrics. They want to know, is the water safe to drink? Is there enough water? Are we going to run out of water in the Colorado River system? You hear that and you see that in the newspapers all the time. And those are numeric questions because they're based on numeric facts. What is the data behind the yes or no answer in that response? And can that number, or can that data be trusted? And evaluating and bringing all that data together is a challenge for many of us in the scientific community. Those of us who have to answer those questions and be responsible for people's, essentially what you're responding to. When I was director, I worked for everybody. I worked for Indigenous people, for homeowners, for golf course owners. I mean, I worked for everybody. And my answer had to be had to be very spot on, because that's what people were looking for from me as the head of the agency on water. They wanted those answers. And could they trust that, trust that answer? That is all in the data behind that. And all my years of working in that field and coming up as an intern in the organization really gave me confidence in that what information we did have, as hydrologists, as we employ hydrologists, as we employ water resource analysts, and as we bring in different perspectives. Every perspective is important in this, and where data is coming from and where we can find that data. But the problem with data and the metric issue is it is a glimpse in time, right? We're talking about, we've got great data on this from 1970 to 1993, or 1900 to current, the record when you look at the Colorado River system, and how do we develop data beyond that? And that's where the creativity, you can really start getting a bit more creative. Can't remember if it was Salt River Project had done or had sponsored a tree ring study, and in that tree ring analysis, or in those tree ring analyses, we now have data on the Colorado system going back to 1600, now to 1000 AD. Still, that's just a glimpse in time. It's just a glimpse, and to really value, as Janene's saying, valuing all of that together is you've got to realize it's a glimpse in time, and we can answer that question only for that glimpse in time. You know, what's going to happen is really contingent on what else is going on in the world. And I think that's, you know, climate change and other factors sort of drive that train. It's a, you know, it's a bit of an anomaly, right, from our data-driven analyses. It doesn't undermine that data, and that data is hugely important. And being able to back that data up long term, you know, I've seen situations where data gets, you know, like it gets changed. It's like, oops, it gets changed. That makes people less, you know, they think you're up to something. They think you're trying to hide something, you know. So it's collecting data and bringing that data and keeping the trust, you know, the public trust, you know, not willy-nilly making changes, but being able to understand why these updates are occurring and things like that. It's, you know, it's a very basic answer. My answer is very basic. It's just very narrowly, you know, scoped in my expertise, but there's so much more to it. And that transparency and building that public trust are so key in developing information and communicating that information. That's really the bottom line.
The dreaded, she looks at me, it's now your turn to talk. all these questions are so hard. And this particular question, when I worked for the Central Arizona Project, part of my responsibilities was to do the strategic planning and business planning work for the district. And a great deal of that involved developing metrics. And so I had to do a lot of studying of metrics. And Ted Cook, who's now the general manager, and I wrote a paper once. And in that paper, we talk about metrics and the sort of the things to look out for when you're thinking about using metrics in your organization. And there was a quote in there that we put, and the quote was a quote actually by Einstein. And the quote is, "There are things that can be counted that don't matter, and things that matter that can't be counted." And so I'm in Janene's camp actually, and Sandy can vouch. I am like the data queen too. I feel like numbers tell stories better than words do. I understand them better. I'm more of a numbers kind of a person. But there are things that when it comes time to do metrics, something happens inside of the human brain, and we start to think that the metric is about us and about our performance. And I have never seen an organization that actually measures the right thing. Instead, they always measure things that they can control, because they're somehow, we link up in our minds that if I don't get the right score on the metric, something bad will happen to me. So I am actually not a fan of metrics, at least not in self-metrics. If you're going to measure things, which I can make a good argument for why you need to measure things, have somebody measure them that their job and their livelihood is not dependent upon it. Because if your job, if you feel like it shows that you are failing, you will never pick a metric that is actually useful. It just isn't going to happen. And as far as water scarcity is concerned, I'm not convinced that we actually, and I would say water security. I think there's a big difference between water scarcity and water security. When it comes to water security, I don't know that we need a metric to see that. You know, if I live in a community where I can live a fulfilling life, do the things that I do as a human being, and never have to think about my water until one day it doesn't work. And when I come home and find it doesn't work, I think to myself, I need to call a plumber. Right? That's what water security is, right? But what Janene is describing, what's going on in her community, is that they aren't in that situation. We can very clearly look at some of the things that are going on in the Navajo Nation and realize that there is water insecurity there. What we all should be striving for is an environment where we as human beings can live our lives the way we want to, doing the things we want to do, which don't involve doing the kinds of jobs that the three of us do every day, and that we don't have to worry about water. I don't think you have to measure that, because if that isn't existing in your community, it's apparent, because there is no economic stability, there is no political stability. You don't have to measure something to figure that out, you know. So that, again, that doesn't mean that you wouldn't develop metrics. You should develop metrics. And there are a lot of things that you can measure, but the key is to never ask the people who are in charge to actually do the measuring. Have somebody else do it, and never link it to what somebody is paid. You know, what you instead link is the strategic thinking. So I'm a big fan of strategic thinking. And what is strategic thinking about? Strategic thinking is about going someplace you aren't right now. You know, it's like we could all say, okay, we're going to go on a big trip and we have to figure out where we're going to go. Are we going to go to China? Are we going to go to South America? Are we going to go down the street? Where are we going to go? We have to figure out where we're going to go before we can figure out the actions we need to take to get there. That's true of anything. If we're going to develop a new water supply, we have to all collectively decide what is that going to look like before we can charge down the road and do that. So I'm a huge fan of strategic thinking. I am not a fan of metrics particularly, unless they are used to measure actual outcomes. And then I think they can be very valuable, but it's really hard to do that. I think part of the question was, what are the impediments to water security? And what I would argue is that there are many impediments to water security, and they are unique to each community. And they're not always money. We might think from the get-go that it's money, but they're not always money. They can be everything from competition for growth. They can be geophysical realities. It can be timing. You know, where do we exist in time and space? It can be corruption. It can be overzealous regulations. It can be cultural traditions. And there are many things that can impede our ability to create water security. But what I would argue is the hardest part of dealing with these impediments kind of gets back to the same issue of how we can't measure what we're doing without becoming fearful. And that is understanding what our blame is. And I'm going to use the word blame. What is our part? What is the role we have played in causing us to get wherever we are at that we don't want to be? Whether it's deep water security, whether it's water scarcity, whether it's a physical shortage. How did we get to this point, and what did we personally do to get to that point? If we spend all of our time focusing on what others have done to get us to this point, then when it comes time for us to figure out what we're going to do, we're left with one thing. And that one thing is nagging everybody else. You know, so it's like your mother coming to you and saying, you know, did you clean up your room? You know, did you brush your teeth? That's like a really old fashioned word. Probably a lot of you don't even know what nagging means. So, you know, nagging is where somebody is constantly after you, expecting you to do something that you either are unwilling to do or not ready to do, or don't see why you need to do it or whatever. So when you think about taking action as organizations, as communities, as human beings, if you spend all of your time focusing on other people and what they're doing or not doing and what they should be doing, you're going to be very unhappy, because what you need to do is really think about what you're going to do. And the minute you change what you're doing, the ripple effect of that starts to move into action. And so it's important to really get a handle on what is your part of the blame and how you got where you are, so that the answers become, what are the actions that you can take as a person, as an organization, as a community, to go from where you are to where you want to be. And so that's I guess my response to that. These are such hard questions. It's unbelievable.
No, thanks. That was a good discussion on metrics, good for all of us to hear. So I'll move along to the next question, which is that the legal framework for water in the West has developed mainly around European ideas of resource ownership. So that's created opportunities for some at the expense of others, particularly Native nations. So that's to acknowledge that there of course, have been inequities in our history in terms of resource allocation and leadership. So going forward, how do we create inclusive processes in water resource planning? We're always sort of hearing like hollow suggestions on we want diversity inclusion in our system. So how do we do that? And who leads that effort, knowing that has a significant impact on who feels welcome to sit at that table?
It's another easy question. Softballs. This is a core part of the work that I started doing on the Navajo Nation. When I first moved back, I was already working at the international level with tribes and indigenous peoples from all over the world, creating new standards and safeguards through international mechanisms to help further their fights and for protection of their lands, territories, and resources. And doing that work in 2011, there was a UN risk assessment that was done. And I think Dr. Margaret Heise Redsteer was one of the lead scientists in that. And it was focused specifically on the Navajo Nation. And in there, they had such alarming conclusions and findings and predictions that all I did for a few hours afterwards was cry. I was alarmed because they were predicting how devastating the drought would be for our people, how much the desertification of our lands would spread, and how impossible it would be for us to maintain even the small ways of living, traditional ways of living that we've been able to preserve through all the other waves of colonization and conquest on our lands. And against our peoples, like how little of that would be able to carry on simply for the fact that there would not be enough water. And that the change in precipitation patterns would create such a huge impact that it would set off a chain reaction among the ecosystems in our reservation. And back then, 2017 felt like a long time away, and I felt emboldened and purposeful, and that it was needed to return home and work on these issues. And we started meeting with communities to talk about, what conditions their waters were in, what climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies they had. And I came back thinking that, everyone must be up in arms and trying to respond to this big threat, right? Sadly, we realized very quickly how much information has been kept from our communities, how much data has been kept from them, how even though there were federal and state agencies collecting climate data all around our reservation lands, much of it wasn't collected in our communities. So they side-skirted and sidestepped some of the obligations that have been created through the Navajo Nation establishing its own IRB that create safeguards for the sharing of that information so communities can understand what's going on. And so the context that we saw was that people didn't even know and didn't have access to any information to understand what the impacts were and what the threats were. But they had oral histories. They had they had memory, historical memory. And so we started working from that. And in the midst of us realizing how little our own people knew about the conditions of our water and what was there and what wasn't, and how quickly the landscape was shifting, former Senator John Kyle and late Senator John McCain were introducing the 2012 Navajo Hopi Little Colorado River Water Rights Settlement into the Senate before it ever was introduced or explained to our communities, before our communities even had any information about what was going on with our water, before they even understood like how much we have been studied to know and to predict how extreme the impacts of climate change would be on our lands and our peoples and our way of life. And that in itself was a great injustice, but we kept going, kept working with the community, trying to gather as much data as we could, because we're like, if this is going to go through, we need to, assess these numbers that are in the settlement to really understand if we're getting enough water for all of our needs, if we're getting enough water to truly sustain and protect a permanent homeland for our people, as is our treaty rights, and as is some of the basic rights of Indigenous peoples when it comes to water rights negotiations and litigation. However, it's hard to use oral histories in water rights negotiations. It's next to impossible. And yet Dr. Margaret Heiser Redsteer showed with her own tree ring study how even though we had huge data gaps in water precipitation patterns and how it's changed over time across the landscapes of the Navajo Nation, that the histories and stories of the sheep herders, the farmers, the families that live there aligned exactly with what she found from tree ring studies. And she could pinpoint, where these shifts in and these stories about the big snows are, the lack of rains, are the drying up of little springs and of rivers and of lakes, how they coincided with that historical record. And yet our people, that made me realize, like, our people had a lot of data. It's just that it's never been validated before. And even when it's validated, we're still not able to use it in these negotiations because the framework of these negotiations and the way that water rights are negotiated is structured and rooted in the very ideology that has been concerned and invested in the eradication of our peoples and our worldview from the onset. And so where in our water law, let alone, how is it in alignment with hydrologic science, but where in the water law is it in alignment with spirit or with the lived experiences of Indigenous peoples? Like I said before, when the first, the foundation of our compact that we're working working within, the limitations that's created, the criteria it's created, all of that was created when our people weren't considered human and we weren't counted as such. And yet we're being pressured that the only way that we can have access to clean drinking water, the only way we can get funding for the necessary infrastructure that could have saved half our population that we lost from the pandemic, had we had that before, had there been justice before a global pandemic hit our communities. The only way we can access any of that is if we agree to a negotiation and to a settlement that protects the interests of the state and of corporate parties and of the people who originally benefit from that compact and the way that it was created. Where is the justice in that? How are we still being asked today to fit all that we are, our entire experiences, our worldviews, everything that is precious to us, within a structure, a process, and a system that doesn't even know how to honor our lives now? When we tried regardless. We kept going, trying to collect the information and the data, trying to put a number to this life-giving source that we needed, a number that would be adequate enough for us to not only have, ensure that there is a possibility for us to access clean drinking water into the future, but also enough that would help us restore the health of our soils, enough to protect our precious and sacred pinon trees and sage bushes and juniper trees, a number that would help us bring our wildlife back, a number that would help our streams flow again. And when we were doing that, we realized that there's no way the system was ever set up for us to be able to do that, even though that's what we need for a permanent homeland. And that's the only way we'll get a permanent homeland. And so in doing that work, my elders are the ones that decided if we're given a choice. If we continue to participate in these negotiations, we are just as culpable in killing our river. And so we made a very hard decision to step back from that work. Meanwhile, the negotiations go on, and we're scared about what they will end up producing. But we're committed to fighting it, because not just us, but all people who depend on this lifeline of the Southwest deserve better. And we deserve a better framework, and we deserve a better process, and we deserve better laws and agreements to restore our relationship with our mother river so that we can all be protected from now into the future.
So you, not to sound contrary here in this conversation, but while I appreciate the sensitivities and the framework that we're looking at this particular issue, especially as we talk about, you know, the structure, the water rights structure that we have in the West, and where that, you know, how that comes and how we can operate in that structure, and how are we going to be inclusive in that structure of other perspectives. Our problem is as practitioners of folks who have to operate in that system is the system that we're all subject to. We are all required to, here's how much water you get, here's how much, you know, you can use it here, you can not use it here. The attempt by the federal and state governments to do, whether it's water rights negotiations with tribes or even on federal lands for environmental flows, those are also areas that history, you know, particularly in Arizona, water rights history is sort of left behind. There's no water right for environmental flows included in the state's water rights system. The trying to bring, you know, exactly what Janine's saying here, the values of individuals across the spectrum, the huge spectrum of water users, it's hard. I mean, it's hard. It's not, I'm not saying you ignore it because it's hard. It's how do you bring all those varying points of or perspectives and personal sort of feelings and the emotion. Water's emotion. I mean, let's be clear here. As you know, a former regulator, the former regulator for the state of Arizona, water is extremely emotional. Not just for, you know, one group or another group. It is very emotional. You know, receiving a phone call on a Saturday afternoon as I'm, you know, playing in the park with my daughter, and I've got a little old 78-year-old woman in Bullhead City crying in the phone, literally. I mean, I put my cell phone on the website as the director because I wanted these calls. Crying to me, she's crying, I'm out of water and I have nobody to help me. I'm sitting here in Tempe, Arizona, you know, like, what do I do for this poor woman? You know, my well has gone dry. I have no water. I'm going to die. It's like, you know, like call 911, do what, you know, it's emotional. It is personal and it is emotional. And how do you put personal feelings into water rights structure? How do you bring that into negotiations? Janene has given us a good example of one way to do that, and it's hearing these oral stories from the tribal elders. So what do we have to do that? We have to listen. As water managers and as water practitioners, we have to hear and listen, but it has to be everybody listening to everybody, not one side being told to listen to me because I'm right, or you know, you being told to listen to Terry Sue because she's right. We all have to listen. And that's the only way we're going to bring inclusiveness and bring the various perspectives into this. Who's going to do that? That's going to be you. I'm sorry, it is you, because it hasn't happened yet, right? Let's be real here. It hasn't happened yet. You know, the story of the, you know, Senators Kyle and former Senator McCain going to the you know, Navajo and Hopi nations. I sat in those negotiations as a junior, you know, essentially a scribe, and the tribal council was there. That's all we understood to do, right? The tribal councils were in those negotiations. How do we get past that? How do we move beyond that? If that wasn't enough, what is what's enough? You know, I'm not trying to pick on Janene here. I'm just saying, we as the folks who have to negotiate these things, you know, we have perspectives, we have emotions as well, but how do we bring the right people into the room? And it's these types of conversations. She doesn't dislike me, I don't dislike her, I don't think, right? You don't dislike me at all. We're pals. We have to talk, but we have to hear. We have to hear each other. And that's going to be the challenge for all of us. And what structure do we set up to make that happen, right? You know, what's the right structure to make that happen? How are you going to deal with that? We've tried to be as inclusive as possible. Every water right, you know, we're doing this the old fashioned way, but we're doing it the best way we know how. And it's being educated, respectfully educated, not being accused, and being, you know, having these types of conversations where we find that right path. So it's all going to be on you. We're passing the torch. Help us figure that out. So
Thanks. Terry Sue.
Yet another easy question. So I guess my experience of the water, you know, the water community in Arizona, having worked for a number of different entities, is there are winners and losers in every single sector. So you can look at the municipal sector and you have huge winners. We're sitting here in the city of Tucson, as holds the largest CAP entitlement of any subcontractor in of the M&I subcontractors. And I work for a company that has utilities that have, we actually own the system that serves Oracle and Saddlebrook, just north of here. And our CAP allocation is like this, right? So we also serve the Casa Grande area, and we have the largest M&I CAP subcontract in Casa Grande. But all of Pinal County has 15,000 acre feet of CAP water, compared to the 144,000 acre feet that Tucson has. There are winners and losers within the agricultural sector. We have irrigation districts that have enormous entitlements to Colorado River water. We have irrigation districts that have no entitlement to any water except groundwater. We have indigenous communities that have no entitlement to Colorado River water, and we have indigenous communities that have more Colorado River water than anyone in the entire Colorado River system. So it isn't as simple as it isn't as simple as there's a certain sector of water users who are completely in the down position, and a certain sector that are in the up position. It's a very complex environment. As far as how to include people in processes, so this is, I think, an issue that as an industry we've struggled with for a long time, is how do you get the different stakeholders together to talk about an issue. And I would say, like in the early 2000s, I concluded that it didn't matter how smart we were, it didn't matter how sound our solutions were, our technical solutions, it didn't matter how many studies we'd done that showed that we were, you know, we had the right answer, that people need to have a say in making decisions about their lives, period. Their values need to be reflected in those decisions. And as technical people, we have a tendency to want to wash that away because it starts to get emotional, like what Sandy's talking about. And people like us who work in this field, maybe we're a little emotionally, you know, whatever. You know, we're a little more analytical. And so we have a tendency to want to remove the emotion from the equation. But emotions really are data, really in the final analysis are data, just like actual data is data. And your value system, our value system as community, our value system as state, our value system as countries, all play into what we're comfortable with, what those decisions are. So in the early 2000s to mid 2000s, I made a decision to develop some skills in facilitation. And this is going to sound really corny, but I I tested out a whole bunch of different facilitation methods, and I found one called the technology of participation, which is a method developed by the Institute of Cultural Affairs, which is an international community development organization. And they go into communities all over the world and they help people co-create their problems and the solution that goes with it through conversations, through small group conversations and then big group conversations. And so I became proficient at that method and then tried to employ them in the water industry. And I did 2 or 3 projects that involved really adhering to these very inclusive techniques, and the idea that everyone who comes in the room has wisdom, and making sure that everybody had a seat at the table, and then they had an opportunity to share their thoughts, even to the degree of considering whether somebody is introverted or extroverted. And and what I can tell you is that in the water industry has a very hard time with inclusive processes. I think that my career was actually damaged by a couple of those processes and my stick-to-itiveness to being committed to doing that kind of work. And so it's the industry as a whole, because I think it's so data centric and because of what Janene was talking about, which is this institutional conditioning that we're all subject to. It's very hard for us to be okay with a couple of things. One is emotions, and the other one is being wrong, making a mistake. We live in a society that says that we cannot make mistakes. And I would challenge anyone in this room to think about just how many mistakes you've made today, just since this morning, whether it's a factual mistake or how you treated somebody just today. So we all make mistakes, but for some reason in our society, our institutional cultural conditioning, we cannot be wrong. We can never be wrong. And we have to prove that our decision is right. And that takes us down a really difficult path, a really difficult path. Now, as far as the idea of excuse me, I think he said something about who feels welcome sitting at the table. I found that to be a very interesting way to phrase the question. And I thought about that a lot. And I am one of those people who honestly is not comfortable sitting at the table. This is out of my comfort zone right here. I'm the kind of person who likes to set the table. I can make all the food. I can make the environment look great. I can make sure that, I don't have 2 relatives sitting together that shouldn't be sitting together. I can create a great environment for people to come together to talk about their issues. I do not like to sit at the table. I just don't feel comfortable doing it. So what I would say is that something that my father used to say to me is 90% of the job is showing up. It's just simply showing up. And so whether or not I'm comfortable sitting at the table is sort of irrelevant. If there's a table, I need to get comfortable with the idea that I need to sit at the table. I am 57 years old and I am still uncomfortable sitting at the table. But I feel I have to do it. Now there's a particular person that I'm going to mention. His name is Rod Lewis, who I consider to be one of the greatest water attorneys that the state of Arizona has ever seen. And he has represented the Gila River Indian community his entire life. I can tell you that there was never a table set that Rod Lewis did not show up at. And he was an amazing advocate for that community. And I believe that they are where they are today in terms of water security, in terms of water resources, as a result of that man's undying desire, passion, whatever you want to call it, to sit at the table with people. Chutzpah. That guy had chutzpah. He really had chutzpah. And It didn't matter if you were his best friend or his worst enemy. He would always sit at the table with you. So one of my pieces of advice is that if you want to be in the game, you need to, and you get invited to the table, then go sit at the table. If you're not comfortable going and sitting at somebody else's table, set your own damn table, invite all your friends and your enemies to come to your table. But don't stop. Don't sit and say, I'm not comfortable with how everything looks right now, and I'm just going to sit here until the world changes and looks like something I'm comfortable with, because it is never going to change to look like what you want it to look like. It's not going to change for me. It's not going to change for Sandy. It's not going to change for Janene. We have to be willing to step out of how we want the world to look like and into the world as it is and start there. Once we get there, then we can start to have influence over moving it into a direction that we want the world to be.
Great, thank you all so much. So I think I'm just going to ask one last question before we open it up to the audience for questions to make sure we have time for that. But we'll just have 10 minutes for this question, so I'll time you on a couple minutes each. So we've heard a lot about water augmentation options lately. There have been a lot of state studies and probably other places in the Southwest about looking for that next bucket of water, but there's been also a lot of concerns about maybe we shouldn't be looking for a next bucket of water. So the question is now, with climate change and tier 1 shortage on the Colorado River, can we rely on demand management strategies? Are we still in that place? Or are in your sectors, are you really seriously considering certain augmentation options that you maybe weren't even 10 years ago? So what are sort of the politically and economic options that you're considering right now? And yeah, we can start with Janene again.
On the Navajo Nation and our work, we really started to,
Oh, sorry.
I forgot I don't have a fancy color. On the Navajo Nation, what we've really started to do is focus, particularly because of how the pandemic hit our community so hard. We shifted focus to really look at those households that were most rural and most vulnerable, and that even if we had all the funding in the world, would probably never in their lifetimes access or have a water pipeline built to their homes, or electrical lines built to their homes. And so in doing that work, one of the things that became very obvious is that, because we were hesitant as well about like desalination projects and different solutions to make brackish water drinkable. We're concerned because we're like, we have to use the systems we're using now sustainably. Are we just, opening up another resource for exploitation? How is that going to then add to like our overconsumption of already very precious and limited water resources? But we've been exploring it more cautiously. But I think the key that has really helped us, step into this carefully is that we're doing it on an individual household level, and not looking about, doing and providing this technology to facilitate mass consumption of these brackish water resources. And we're doing it because we know that it is the only way we're going to get these households drinkable water immediately and for the near future. And so we're actually, my company, Sixth World Solutions, has actually partnered with the University of Arizona to develop several prototypes of solar nanofiltration systems and UV filtration systems, also solar powered, that are enough to filter water for household use. And now we're in the process of modifying those designs based on our community feedback and their use of it, to see how we can continue to improve and manufacture these units for both community water, household water systems, but now also for community water systems. And but in those conversations and in the designs and in the vetting of the technology, we honor the process that resonates most with us. We set our own table and invite the people that need to be involved in those conversations. It's funny, all the talk about setting tables, it reminds me of one of my colleagues who, in our UN work, had a saying like, If you're not invited to the table, you're probably on the menu. And this probably applies mostly to Indigenous peoples in our lands, territories, and resources. But that's one of the things I was thinking about as we're using the metaphor of the table. And so like we have learned early on that even when we're invited, we're not listened to. Even when we're listened to, it doesn't lead to action. And so often we have to, like always, build the damn table from scratch and restore the food system so that we can serve the food and control the menu in order for us to have a chance to really work from a place that is most meaningful and most effective for the issues that we're facing. And so in building and embedding these technologies and the possible design for it and how it could be used for our communities, we did just that. Bringing our own Indigenous scientists together along with our non-Native allies and partners and accomplices, with our community members and our community leaders, with the household members, ensuring that we're inclusive in that process too, involving all the way down to the little itty-bittiest member of the household. To talk about why these systems are being developed, how it could be developed to be helpful. And one of the ways that changes the conversation is that we start from really understanding the need and the responsibility to consume water sustainably, wisely, and with respect. And I think that's what makes it different if we're like, for example, from the conversations that happened a few years back about creating desalination plants at a large scale. Is like those conversations were just about how do we continue to produce and output the water needed for our way of life now. We didn't talk about consumption. We didn't talk about responsibility. We didn't talk about these other things that need to be changed and part of a new culture of water development going forward. And so I hope that experience can continue to be scaled out. And I just went way over time. So I'm going to cut off awkwardly. Thank you. Bye.
Good. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, you ask about demand management and its role in this structure and as in its role in augmentation as well. I mean, if we are going to augment our water supplies, if we're going to bring water supplies in and continue to waste water, then it's just a waste of money. That I believe we're close to saying the same thing here, that if we continue the way that we're doing things, we're making big investments in things that are, what's the point, I guess. But I think that demand management is becoming, we did a really good job in the early 80s with demand management in this state. We had the creation of the 1980 Groundwater Management Act. You can see a steep decline in water use overall, particularly in the municipal sector, in how people were using water. It's sort of bottoming out a bit, or not even bottoming. Again, we're going back to data, glimpse in time, but you're looking at sort of this shift, right? But now we're starting to see a shift again in demand management's role in how we're going to use water. That's the low-hanging fruit, right? I mean, it's get people to change their behavior first before you bring the bag of lollipops over to reward them. You've got to change that behavior, then you get the reward. And so I do see demand management as a key element moving forward. I see that, how many of us learn from our parents, turn off the water, when you're brushing your teeth. I mean, those are little things, but they're meaningful. It's that behavior thing that's moving us. So really, we're looking at augmentation. We're looking at primarily reuse for our mining operations. How do we reuse the water? Instead of going and taking more water, how can we maximize the reuse of those molecules before, essentially so that we can reduce our take from the system? That's just how we're looking at it internally. But then we're not just looking at ourselves. That's the question is sort of like, how are you doing it? Well, we're doing it with our communities. We're doing it with our Indigenous partners. We're doing it with others. So as we're developing alternative water supplies, as we're developing, mechanisms for the future, we're first focusing on our own demand management, our own reuse, and then the needs of the community, not just the needs of the mine. Our people live in those communities. They live in those cities and towns. They live on reservations. They live, this is what we're doing is we're part of that system. We're not apart from it. So it's not looking at these augmentation projects from a narrow lens anymore. It's looking at it from, what have we done in the past? What do we need to do today? And how can we build something that's actually more helpful for the communities that we live in? And if that includes augmentation, what is our role in facilitating that augmentation? Quick, sorry.
Thanks. 3 minutes, Terry Sue.
So I'll just add just really quickly to what my colleagues have said is something that I say to my daughter a lot is to incorporate the word "and" into your life instead of the word "or." So whatever you're thinking about, diversity is the key to life. It's the key to peace in our society. It's the key to happiness, personal happiness. And the trigger for me on that is the word "and." I can do this, and I can do that. It's not I can do this or I can do that. So I can develop groundwater. I can develop ocean desalination. I can develop brackish groundwater. I can develop effluent. I can develop local surface waters. It's always and. So minimize the word "or" in your vocabulary and use the word "and" more. And then the other thing that I would mention relative to this question is sort of figuring out which of these is politically feasible. And I would argue that the one that's politically feasible, whatever the next one is in line, is going to be the one that is economically affordable. And that gets us all the way kind of back to the original idea of what water security is. And that's our ability as a population to manage our water in a way that provides adequate quantity and an acceptable level of quality to sustain safe, healthy livelihoods, including peace and political stability at a price that we can afford. That's the whole point. So if you're going to come into this business and do this work, everything we do, all the data analysis, all the studies, all the stuff is about creating a quality of life for people where they can actually live their lives without worrying about whether or not there'll be water in their house and whether the quality of that water will be acceptable and safe for them to drink, so that we can have stable economies, stable political systems, so that when the COVID hits, we can survive the COVID. And in areas of our state and in areas of our country where we have water insecurity, something that Janene said that I think is really true is that we have to think about the most vulnerable in our societies, in our communities. And we have a responsibility as a people, as a population, to make sure that those vulnerable populations are taken care of.
All right, thank you so much. If we could give them all a round of applause.
Yeah, big round of applause. Wow. That was an incredible discussion. Thank you, Terry Sue, for bringing us home with that last summary point, and all of you guys for your thoughts. We're going to open it up to question and answer from the audience. Before anybody raises their hand, I have a quick 30-second question for each of you. It's easy. You're in a room full of physical scientists. In the spaces you walk in, what is something that actionable that you're missing? And it's science from science and scientists specifically. And I'm going to start. Yeah. The question is, you're a room full of scientists. And the question, hi guys. The question is probably, I probably shouldn't be asking this question. The scientists should be asking this question. So we're going to revise that. I saw a few people's hands go up. Scientists, let's ask some questions to our panelists. The first hand I saw was actually over there.
So this question is for Janene. So you were talking about all the injustices that your people have faced, and that really got my activist motor running, if you couldn't tell. One of the things that kind of made me think of is the recently passed Build Back Better Act. I've heard a thing or two about how, it's supposed to provide these kind of things like high-speed internet and also good infrastructure in general to underserved communities like yours. What is your kind of outlook, opinion on that? How do you think it'll affect you?
Very great question. One that's not as easy to answer because you have to understand the layers of bureaucracy that we're under in order to be able to even use any funds that are ever allocated to tribal nations. But the Build Back Better, the Navajo Nation, got one of the largest infusions of funds from that funding stream. And for a long time, our tribal government was really grappling with what constituted qualified expenses and what didn't, like what fell outside of that. And at the end of the day, what we're seeing happening is that because it's so difficult to navigate, the different interpretations of what can and cannot be covered under the Build Back Better Act, that the easiest thing is to just use those funds for projects that were already kind of working through its way through the approval process. And so that doesn't allow us to do the type of responses or the innovative thinking and planning that is necessary for us to use those funds in the most effective way. And it's kind of tying us into these dinosaur projects that were developed a lot of times not to benefit Navajo peoples, but to move water so that the Navajo Nation could continue to be developed. And to move water through the Navajo Nation so that it could get to other places that are off reservation but adjacent to the nation. And so even with the plans that are there now, one of the things that our communities raised early on when we started doing this community engagement and organizing at the grassroots level to really get people involved and being part of decisions around water development and water management. One of the things that was clear was that even the data that's being used by Indian Health Services and by other entities that are trying to help us build the water infrastructure is so completely inaccurate that right now, a lot of the projects are only slated to meet the needs of about 30% of our population that needs it. And so, there's other injustices that are built into that. But I say all of this to kind of go back to your question, the role of scientists in the work that you're doing. I know, your training, your field, your expertise, the pathways that you're on require a certain way of thinking, but none of that excuses being ignorant about the rights of the people that you're engaged in and with. None of that excuses continuing to be ignorant about the history of our tribal governments and how they were set up and why they're not representative. And none of that excuses being ignorant about the poor practices of federal and state level consultation, because our people have been demanding a shift from the era of consultation to one of consent for generations. And we went as far as developing international standards in order to facilitate the framework, the development of the frameworks that could then be implemented through all levels of government here. Free, prior, and informed consent it should not be a theory. Consultation should not just constitute having meetings with a few tribal representatives. Particularly when the history is very clear that our tribal governments were set up specifically to make that easier for, for outside entities to be able to do that work. But we don't need easy anymore. We need the difficult, we need the brave, we need the courageous. And that requires us to be equipped and tooled with the type of understanding that will allow us to build relationships in an equitable way. And there's enough information. I mean, we all got anti-Google now, you know, there's enough. Google the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Read the sections about our technologies, our sciences, our worldviews, and our way of life. Read a lot of these international documents, from the Paris Agreement to the COP negotiations, and see how we are winning ground on the international level and getting our traditional ecological practices, sciences, worldviews, languages, and ways of knowing recognized for the asset that it is in understanding how to build regenerative systems and institutions and solutions in response to climate change. Because we need that happening here as well. Arizona and New Mexico have some of the highest concentrations of Native tribes in the US. That's an opportunity to create new models of collaboration for our shared management of our shared resources. And every scientist has a responsibility to at least be aware of the background of the communities that you're dealing with and the ways that you can become an ally in promoting our rights.
All right, round of applause. Thank you, sir. Thank you guys for your questions, your comments, your concerns, and a wonderful first ever keynote panel of the El Día del Agua y la Atmosfera conference. So we're going